Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast, where I bring to you the interesting stories of guests from a wide variety of backgrounds. On today's episode, I have a very special guest, creator of the world-famous Dilbert cartoon and author of many well-renowned books, including How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, as well as Loser Think. My guest is none other than the well-renowned Scott Adams. On this episode, we discuss his incredible journey to success through positive affirmations, creating the Dilbert Comic, maintaining constant growth through failure, loser think in society, the interesting case of persuasion and hypnotism, and pursuing opportunity over passion, among other interesting topics. Before we begin, if you enjoy the episode or the show, please make sure to subscribe to the All Things Interesting podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. And as always, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Tesher Cohen and Instagram or Facebook at All Things Interesting Podcast. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, Scott Adams. Hey Scott, welcome to the show. We're really excited to have you here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So everybody seems to know you well enough through your comic Dilbert, and it's seemingly what you're most well known for. But I want to kind of navigate this in a roundabout way, because one of the interesting things about you is that a lot of your success and influence was a result of, I would say, positive affirmations, and it's something you credit a lot of your current success to. So I kind of want to start things off by getting your thoughts on how that came to be and kind of intertwine Dilbert within that.
Well, there's a long version of the story and a shorter version. I'll try to maybe hit somewhere in between. So first of all, what affirmations are is when you're writing or repeating an affirmative statement about what you hope to happen, such as, I, Scott Adams, will become a billionaire, or I, Scott Adams, will become a cartoonist. So I heard about this concept when I was, I guess, in my 20s, and it was presented to me as something that works almost like magic, and you should just try it. I, of course, am very skeptical, and I said, well, why would that work? I mean, there's not even a reason why that would work. And I was talking to somebody persuasive and smart who said, yeah, just try it. It doesn't cost you anything. So I thought, well, all right, I'll try it. So I tried a statement that I would, let's say, have an interaction with a young woman that I had seen but didn't even know her name. Just somebody I knew of but didn't know. And weirdly, a whole bunch of coincidences, like really, really big coincidences, started to string together, and the next thing you know, I was on a date with this woman. And I thought to myself, this is impossible. Like, I actually picked the least likely thing to happen in my mind. I thought, okay, because I actually picked somebody I thought was way out of my league. And I was told to try an affirmation on something that you know wouldn't happen by chance. You know, something so unlikely that you could prove to yourself there was something to it. So, of course, now I've got a dilemma because it looked like it worked, but then I immediately said to myself, you know, maybe I'm just more attractive than I thought. You know, maybe I've got more game than I realized. So you can always talk yourself out of it. So I thought, well, all right, I'll pick something that's like even less likely, you know, so I can eliminate all doubt. So I started doing an affirmation that I would get rich in the stock market. And I'd never even bought a stock. I didn't even have a brokerage account. And one day I woke up in the middle of the night with the thought that I should buy stock in Chrysler. Now, at the time, Chrysler was in bankruptcy. So it was a major auto dealer that was in bankruptcy, and its stock was, just practically nothing at that point. So thinking to buy that stock was, at least on the surface, the least likely thing that would be a good idea. So I quickly tried to open a Schwab account, but some paperwork got messed up. And by the time I actually opened it, it had already gone up, 10 or 20%. And I thought, it would have worked. I would have made 10 or 20% in just a few weeks. What a genius I am. And so I said, well, I guess I missed the boat. That stock went on to be the number one stock of the entire year. So it just, because they came out of bankruptcy, and the moment it was clear that they wouldn't be bankrupt, it went back to something like a normal company stock. So of all the stocks, I think there are 10,000 stocks roughly, I had somehow, with no experience, picked the best one out of 10,000. And it wasn't even an obvious choice. It wasn't recommended by anybody. So I missed the boat, though. I didn't trust it to stay with it. So I thought, well, I'll try it again. So I did my affirmations again. And one day I'm leafing through a newspaper, and there's this big ad for a company I'd never heard of called Ask Computer, ASK. I'm not sure they're still in business. I don't think they are. But they were doing a new offering for stock. I said, all right, there's something about this. I just feel it. Again, no research, didn't know anything about it. So I bought a little bit of it, probably, a few $100s worth, which is all I could afford. And it immediately went up, like 10, 20%, I forget the details. And I thought, I'm a genius. I just made $100 doing nothing. I just sat here in my living room being smart, and I just made $100, which at the time was big money to me. I was barely meeting my bills. And so I sold it. I made $100, and I thought, I'm a genius. That stock went on to be one of the most storied stocks of the entire year. It was one of the highlight stocks at the end of the year when they say, man, the biggest gainers of the year. And I'm looking at this after I sold it for my $100, and I'm thinking, what are the odds that I would pick two of the best stocks in the world with no understanding of the stocks themselves, right, one after another? So it wasn't long after that I said, maybe I should just raise my sights. And it wasn't long after that. There was one other incident. Well, I'll tell you the other incident. I had a bet with somebody about retaking my GMATs, the test you take to see if you can get into business school. And I made a bet with somebody who was taking a prep class. And I bet that without taking a prep class, I could beat not only my last score by a lot, and there's no reason to think I could do that, but I would beat her new score that she would retake the test after taking the prep course. And it was a dumb bet because her first score was a lot better than my first score, and she was taking a prep class and I wasn't, right? It's just a dumb bet. So I make this bet, did a couple of practice tests at home, and I got basically the same score I got the first time I took it, which was too low to go to a good graduate school. I think it was 77th percentile. And I know I needed to be in the 90s somewhere to get into, let's say, Berkeley. So I take the test, wait a few weeks, and I had been doing my affirmations and specifically concentrating on the score of 94, a 94th percentile. Now, to go from a 77 to a 94 is basically unheard of. I mean, it just doesn't really happen. And if you don't take a prep class, the odds of that happening are really bad. So I take the class, I take the test, I open up my mail several weeks later, and I look in that little box where I'd been imagining a 94 would be, because I'd taken the test before, so I knew what the result page looked like, and I knew where to look. And I look in that little box, and it said 94.
What?
Yeah, it didn't say 93. It didn't say 95. It said 94. And I was living alone at the time, single guy in San Francisco. And I look at this thing, and I couldn't convince myself I was really seeing it. And I would put it down next to me, and I would stare at the wall in front of me, and I'd think, no, that didn't just happen. And then I'd pick it up, and I'd look at it again. And then I'd put it back down, and I'd say, No, that didn't just happen. And I kept picking it up and looking at it and putting it back down for the rest of the night because I couldn't convince myself that had really happened. Now, first of all, I won the bet by a lot, as it turns out. That also got me into Berkeley. So I got my MBA from a top school because of winning that stupid bet. But after that, I started thinking, okay, these things seem so unlikely. Maybe I should just raise my sights because I hadn't really been shooting for, something that big. And so I thought, I think I'll try to become a syndicated cartoonist. And I started Affirmation, I, Scott Adams, will be a syndicated cartoonist. And I submitted some cartoons, and I think the odds of being picked are 1 in 2,000. That's about how many submissions these syndicates get every year. And of the ones who get picked, the odds of actually going on to get published and then succeeding, maybe 1 in 20,000. And
wow, those are some
yeah,
terrible odds.
Yeah, but here I am. So I've written extensively on this. Now, if anybody's listening to this, they're saying, well, that's either a selective memory, Scott. Maybe you don't remember the times it didn't work. Maybe you just have more talent than you think, so it's all an illusion. And those are all perfectly good criticisms. So the way I frame it in retrospect is this. I don't know why it appears to work. And all I can say for sure is it appears that way. You have the sensation that something happened. Later, when I had an incurable voice problem, which allowed me to, made me unable to speak for about 3.5 years. And I finally got a diagnosis, and I found out it was something called spasmodic dysphonia. And it was incurable. There was just nothing you could do about it. You would just not be able to speak for the rest of your life. You could make noise, but you couldn't form, the right syllables. Mm-hmm. And I started my affirmations on that. And the affirmation was, I, Scott Adams, will speak perfectly. Now, obviously, I don't speak perfectly now, but you can tell I can speak. Yeah. And I was one of the first people on the planet to actually be cured. I found the doctor who was doing an experimental surgery. Didn't work every time, but worked most of the time. It was risky, but I took the risk, and here we are. And now one of my primary jobs is I do a daily Periscope in which I talk for an hour, and people tell me how much they like my voice. So these things are so extraordinarily unlikely. Oh, and I skipped over the one where I said the first time I ever tried to write a book, my affirmation was, I, Scott Adams, will be a #1 best-selling author. My first book, and I'd never even taken a class in writing, except for a 2-day course in business writing. My first book was a runaway #1 bestseller on the New York Times list. So,
wow, that's incredible.
So having experienced all of these things, I of course looked at my own history and said, all right, what explains this? And I've got a few different explanations. One of them is that it could be false memory. It's entirely possible that I've had lots of affirmations, but because of the way humans are wired, I just forget all the bad ones, the ones that didn't work. Maybe, it's possible. I certainly don't have that sensation, but you can't rule it out. The other possibility, and I think this is a stronger one, is that there is evidence that when you focus on something in particular, it widens your view of perception. In other words, you can notice things you wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't been tuned to that opportunity. It's in a simple way, it's why you can hear your name in a crowded room. You hear the room noise, and the room noise is blah, 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 blah. Scott Adams, blah, blah, blah. You're like, what the hell?
Your ears perk up.
Yeah. How did I pick my name out of all that rumble? And it's because you were tuned to your own name. Mm-hmm. So in my story, there are certainly situations in which maybe I noticed something that perhaps I would not have, maybe pursued something that I wouldn't have if I hadn't, let's say, bolstered my confidence through the affirmations. Maybe I wouldn't have tried something. Maybe I wouldn't have taken the risk. So it could be how it messes with your perceptions. It might mess with them in a positive way. Another explanation might be, and again, this is just speculation, that there are things that were going to happen anyway, and it's just a way for your subconscious mind to tell you that you're on the right path. So imagine, if you will, I said, hey, why don't you start doing an affirmation that you will be an Olympic gymnast. Now, your brain is going to say, no. Now, it's not impossible that a new writer could be a best-selling author. That's not impossible. But it's kind of impossible that you're going to be, start today at whatever age and become an Olympic gymnast. So it's possible that what affirmations are really doing is working backwards, meaning that at some subconscious level, you know what you're capable of, but maybe your conscious mind doesn't. So your rational mind might say, well, there are very few people who become cartoonists. So, it's a bad play.
So it's your mind, in a sense, trying to protect you from itself.
Yes, it might be that the affirmations simply allow your subconscious mind to get back into the decision making, and that the way they did it is through a clever back door, which is you would not be willing to write 15 times a day that you would become a Olympic gymnast. And the reason you wouldn't be willing to write it down is because you know that can't happen.
So is there a specific structure to these sentences that you're writing, or are you simply writing, I'm going to be an Olympic writer or a best-selling author 15 times?
Well, I have no evidence that the specific structure or method makes any difference. It seems to be something about the focus. So I think if you say it out loud, you write it down, you type it, you throw away the paper, you keep the paper. I don't think any of those details matter, or at least I have no evidence to assume that any of that would matter.
This sounds very similar to a book and film called The Secret, in which they talk about willing things into reality by, in a sense, doing positive affirmations and opening up your eyes to the things that were already there, like you mentioned, but that you're not paying attention to. So, like you said, if you tell yourself, I'm going to go ahead and be so-and-so, or I'm going to do this, that, and the other, you're going to actually see those opportunities around you as opposed to ignoring them based off your selective hearing or selective senses, so to speak.
Yeah, so I think that could be part of it. It could be, maybe it's a mixture of illusion plus, focus plus changing your perceptions. It could be some mix of all those things. I don't really know. The other possibility, which is a lot more fun, is that we're living in a simulation.
Oh boy, this is the Elon Musk reference.
Yeah, so Elon Musk, of course, is one of the more famous people for saying that we're probably, this reality that we experience is far more likely, and when I say far more likely, I mean 1 billion to 1 likely, that we're a simulation and not an original species. And for anybody who's not familiar with this, it means that we're already at the point where we could build a simulated world in which the characters we build with software act as though they believe they're real. So in other words, you could program belief into a simulated person right now. And given that any advanced civilization would also be able to do that, and there might be lots of advanced civilizations, and we don't know how long, there have ever been better simulation or better civilizations before ours. Since we know there will be lots of copies for every original, because everybody who's an original will play around with it, have lots of copies, the number of copies is likely to be many, many, many times more than the originals, and both the originals and the copies will believe they were originals. So, if that's true, and we can suspend whether that's true or not, I'll just throw it into the affirmations discussion. If it's true, it could be that the affirmations are a steering mechanism. In other words, it's a way for you to manipulate and reprogram the simulation on the fly. Now, when I look at my life and the things that I've done, even in the last 3 years, if you look at some of my political predictions, etc., it looks exactly like I'm reprogramming the simulation in real time. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that's happening. I'm just saying that it looks exactly like it. So you got lots of possibilities, and they go down to the nature of reality itself.
So you're saying, in a sense, that you're reprogramming a copy of yourself to go down a specific path that's different from the last path your other copy was on. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that whatever I am, whether I'm an original or created by an original, that I'm still just me. So I'm not a copy of the other thing. I'm at this point, whether I'm real or simulated, I'm me. And then it might be that you have some control over the simulation, and that maybe there's some subjectivity to this thing you call reality. Now, it might not be subjective in the sense that, if a big rock falls in your head, it's always going to hurt. You don't have a way around that. But think of all the possibilities that are not hard-coded, or apparently not. Do you get the promotion? Do you get the spouse you want to? All those things. There are infinite possibilities. Could it be that affirmations allow you to pick a path?
Huh. So it sounds very much like a multiverse theory where there's thousands of universes out there, each living in its own reality. But what you're saying is that you could program your mind to go down a specific path of your choosing.
Well, I'm not asserting that to be true. I'm asserting that would fit the observations along with lots of other hypotheses. And in my personal experience, it would fit it best, but that doesn't make it true.
So I want to tie this in a bit to your pursuit of Dilbert, specifically just rewinding back to your childhood. And I want to get your thoughts on, was there a point in time in your life that you were specifically pulled to drawing or cartoons specifically?
Yes. When I was, probably from the time I was 6 years old, maybe younger, I wanted to be a cartoonist. And it's all I wanted. It was my number one life objective. And I enjoyed drawing comics, and I did a lot of it in doodling as a kid. But when I reached the age of 11, and I actually applied to something called the Famous Artist School for Young People, a correspondence class.
Right.
And I applied, and I got rejected. Now, I was rejected because I was 11, and you had to be at least 12 years old to be a famous artist, they told me. So I was under the age requirement. But it was around that time that I reached what I'd call, let's call it the age of reason. Right. Where you don't believe in Santa Claus anymore, and you're kind of looking at the odds. You're saying, okay, I'd like to play in the NBA, but what are the odds? Okay, let's forget that one. I'd like to be a famous movie star, but what are the odds? And so I went through that, and I realized at the time there were 6 billion people on Earth, and there was only one Charles Schultz, and that was the job I wanted. And I thought, okay, forget about that. It's too unlikely. So I thought I'd be a business person, a lawyer, went to school, got an economics degree, worked in the corporate world. And when my corporate careers hit a wall, I could tell you about that, but we'll circle back to that if you care. But it was that point when the rational path no longer worked. And I said to myself, I did everything you're supposed to do. I studied hard, got good grades, got a meaningful degree, something that's useful, went out in the world, took some risks. I did everything right, and I just hit a brick wall. So I thought, well, what if I just act irrationally? Just to give it a try. It won't cost me anything. So that's when I thought, I'll try to see if I can get some cartoons published. And there's a longer story there, but I literally had to release on being rational to succeed.
Would you say there was some outside pressure when it came to that rationality of, I'm going to pursue business, or I'm going to just follow the standard path that everybody else follows? Or was there something else to that?
Well, I would say there's outside pressure just in terms of the world does subtly encourage all of us to not take stupid risks. And it shows us by example that the people who, do what they're supposed to do and stay in their lane, they turn out okay. So I think there was that, subtle, indirect pressure. And then by the time I had decided to try to become a syndicated cartoonist, and I'd show my comics to friends and family and stuff, I can't say that I got a lot of support. Now, there were a lot of people who said, hey, you should try to get your comics published. They'd seen my doodles. But I don't think anybody thought it would work. So I think people just sort of indulged me. That was the feeling I got.
Right.
And so, yeah, there was society always has a subtle pressure.
Yeah, I've noticed that with society in general, where it's kind of like a assembly line, sort of, where people are always following one another down that same path. But if you deviate from that path, there's kind of this hive mind mentality where everyone says that person is wrong, shun that person, or make fun of that person for pursuing that path until you actually succeed or you achieve what you're doing. Because once that happens, this insane person all of a sudden looks not so insane. And I think your story is very similar with that.
Yeah, in my most recent book, Loser Think, I talk about bad thinking habits, and one of the worst ones that bothers me the most is people who will tell you to stay in your lane. You know, stick to your channel, keep your day job.
I hear that so often, day in and day out in the office.
To which I say, you know, if other people took that advice, there would be no airplanes, but you'd have excellent bicycles. You know, because the Wright brothers sort of left their lane a little bit. You wouldn't be talking to me on an iPhone because Steve Jobs was not the phone maker. I mean, that wasn't his strength. And you can go right down the line. You know, Bill Gates had never created a software empire until he did. So people leaving their lanes is what causes civilization to move forward. It's not the thing to avoid. Although I would agree that maybe it's not for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. I think deviating from a traditional path and actually attempting something that your mind was initially pulled to at a young age opens up the doors for a lot more opportunities than if you kind of train your mind to just accept rationality and follow a traditional path. So, yeah, I find that really interesting.
Yeah, there's something meaningful about what you were drawn to at the earliest age. I don't think it's always predictive because, you know, little boys, especially little girls too, but I think more little boys, they think they're going to be cartoonists when they're kids and they're going to play in the NBA and stuff. So, you know, you've got that. But I think I was heading towards some point, but I forgot. I'm sure it wasn't important.
We'll probably find a way to circle back to that somehow. But I wanted to get your thoughts on when you followed that traditional path into business, what were your experiences like? Because in a way, I noticed that it was a big influence for what Dilbert is known for today.
Well, very early on in my career, I decided that I had a strategy for my life, for success, that is. And I would build skills continuously until I had enough. But I wouldn't know exactly where that took me. And later in life, I wrote my book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. I talked about it in terms of those being talent stacks. Mm-hmm. So the idea is you start with any talent, whatever is your natural inclinations, natural ability, and then you intelligently add talents until you have something that's unique. So in my case, my corporate experience gave me access to a lot of different fields, from marketing to technology to contract negotiations, you name it, all kinds of stuff. And then I added to that an ability to write, an ability to draw comics, and that gave me a whole bunch of stuff that was unique, because it's easy to find somebody who can draw better than I can draw. It's easy to find somebody who's funnier than I am, can write better, somebody who has more experience in business, etc. But there aren't many people who can do all of those things well enough. You know, I'm not a world's best at any one of those things, but there aren't many people who have that combination. So it was the combination that made me special. And so in my corporate career, I was very conscious that it wasn't about the paycheck, it wasn't about that job, it wasn't about any specific career path. It was about acquiring new and complementary skills as quickly as possible until I had all kinds of options, which is what happened.
That sounds very similar to an approach by Naval Ravikant. I believe he mentioned something to the effect of it's better to become skilled at a multitude of different or abilities than it is to become an expert at a single skill, because it's going to take you much further than focusing on one specific thing.
Yeah. Now, Naval often talks about the startup world a little bit more than other worlds. And in that world, the best entrepreneurs are the ones who can operate in a variety of fields. Somebody who, if they had to, they could put together their own contract without a lawyer. Somebody, if they had to, could build a web page, they've got a full stack of technology skills, etc.
What would you say was like the starting point of Dilbert when you were kind of in the business world? Was there a moment you were sitting at your desk in an office and you thought to yourself, I'm going to start drawing these comics based off the craziness that occurs in this office? Or was there some other way around that?
Well, I was working at a big bank in San Francisco, and I would sometimes draw cartoons that I would put in my own presentations. So, I'd do a PowerPoint presentation on the budget or something, and I would draw little characters and, make jokes about it. And that's all I was doing. I didn't have ambitions beyond that. And I would draw the character on my whiteboard and, do little comics in the office. And people kept saying, hey, you should do something with that, try to get published. And I thought, well, going back to the story where I said eventually I decided to try it. But I had these little characters that I developed just so I had recurring characters in my little comics. And one of them was this character, Dilbert. But he didn't have a name. He was just a generic nerd. So one day I held a Name the Nerd contest in my office. And I had people come to my whiteboard and write below the character what they thought his name should be. And people would come in all day long, they'd walk by and they'd say, oh, his name should be, Ernie or Poindexter or Martin, all these things. And they all just sort of laid there. All of those names just like, yeah, well, maybe not, nothing. Then one day my ex-boss came in and he saw it and he goes, I got it. And he picks up the eraser or the marker and he writes Dilbert under it. And when I describe the experience that I had at that moment, I can't describe it in normal terms because I felt myself see the future, meaning that it was like being sucked down this long tunnel through time and seeing my future and then being immediately sucked back through the tunnel to the present. And it was because of that name. And when I saw the name, I didn't just think, oh, that would be a good name for a character. I actually saw the future. And I closed the contest and I said, I don't know what happened. I mean, I got goosebumps and something profound happened the moment I saw that name. And sure enough, I think Dilbert's name is actually a big part of what has made it successful because it's an uncommon name, but it fits that character person perfectly.
That's a complete light bulb moment, and I find it fascinating how when you get that zing right there from hearing that name, it kind of transcends and you see the future of the comic from that. But one thing I have to point out though is when you look at the comic, you notice that Dilbert's tie is always, I would say, upside down, I suppose. Was there an artistic reasoning behind the design of Dilbert and the whole comic?
Well, the modern Dilbert comic, he doesn't have a tie. He lost his tie a few years ago, so he's part of the casual office look these days. But originally, he was a doodle, and I don't have any memory of deciding to draw the tie that way. I remember that I did it, and I think generally probably it just had to do with the fact that he was unkempt. His shirt was sometimes untucked, and he was just sort of didn't care about his appearance. But there wasn't any specific reason for it. In later years, I humorously said it's because he's glad to see you, but that was just sort of sort of just a joke. No, there was no reason that I could remember. It's lost in history.
One thing that stands out about Dilbert is that it is incredibly identifiable with the average person. What do you think made the comic like that, from your own experiences working in management? What made Dilbert stand out to anybody that actually reads the comics?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact I'm not an artist. If you're an artist, let's say artist with a capital A,
Mm-hmm.
you believe that you have a vision and that you have something to give the world, and it's coming from you. And if you do it right, they'll really like it. They'll like your art. I'm not an artist. I'm a business person who got into cartooning. And from the business person perspective, everything is about the customer. And what does the customer want to read in their humor? And it turns out that the customer only cares about themselves. They do not care about the artist. They do not care about the artist's vision. And here I'm talking about comics and writing in general. In the comic world, people want to see comics that relate to their experience because that's what they consider funny. So there's no such thing as generic funny, and at least in the comic world. What there is comics that speak to people's personalities and experience, and then they say, aha, oh my God, that just happened to me. And the laughter comes not just from the punchline or the construct of the joke, but from the realizing that you're not alone. Other people are having this frustration, and that's enough often for people to say, I love this cartoon. It's my favorite one. It talks about my life. So part of it is a strategy that comes from how I got to cartooning. So I took a customer first perspective.
Yeah, it's pretty similar to how people are interested in certain shows because they evoke humor that relates to them. I mean, sitcoms might apply to certain people, while you'll have cartoons that kind of throw out jokes that relate to their own personal experiences better. So I think the relating to the general person that works in business is highly successful because day in and day out, many of them live as though they're in an episode of The Office or Office Space, for example, and they relate to them. They see your comic and they see, wow, I just had that happen to me in my office the other day.
Yeah, if you notice, the entire field of humor has evolved into reality. So right now, if I said, what's your favorite sitcom on television? Most people would say none. I don't watch any. If I said, what was the last funny movie you watched? Most adults would say, The Hangover, 9 years ago, or whatever the hell it was. And even people who make movies have commented that you can't make funny movies because everybody's offended now. Mm-hmm. But when I watch the news, if I just turn on the news or read the news, I'm actually reading it for entertainment and for laughs. I'm actually looking for my humor in the news. And the news,
really?
Yeah, and the news has morphed so that they're actually serving up more, humorous, ironic. I can't believe somebody did this. So a lot of what makes me laugh is just the news now. So there's not really humor in the way it used to exist. It's just reality based now.
Yeah, I don't watch the news as often as I used to, but one of the things that I've always noticed is that when there's some event that makes headline news, you'll see a lot of these news channels bring on experts from a bunch of different areas to discuss it. And they talk in this roundtable discussion, and you'll hear one expert say something, and then the next expert will concur, but they don't really provide a solution. They go to break, come back, and then other experts reiterate exactly what the other expert said. And it's like, what just happened? Like, there's nothing here that's adding value to the general viewer of this show, Yeah,
my favorite in that genre is the pundit who says, we've got X and X problem. We need to have a national conversation about it. And I'm thinking, well, that's as close to saying nothing as you could say.
Yeah, exactly. So, on the note of relatability and talking on creativity, how would you describe your creative process when it comes specifically to Dilbert? And I mean this in terms of the artistic direction, as well as coming up with new comics when you release them?
Well, my process has sort of morphed over the years. So the current process has probably changed 3 or 4 times over the career. At the moment, I get a lot of my material either from my own experience, but I only use the stuff, typically, I only use the stuff that would have a business office, analogy to it. And I also ask on Twitter relatively frequently for people to tell me in the comments, what is it that's bothering you at work? And once I have the situation, then it's almost a formula to figure out which characters in the Dilbert universe would be involved and how they would react based on their personalities. So once you have regular characters and they have these stereotyped personalities, which makes them funny, right? They're funny because they're stereotypes. You can usually just plop the situation into that group of characters and okay, this is something the boss would say. This is something that Dilbert wouldn't say, but maybe Alice would. So, and then there's a bit of a formula to writing a joke. And I just follow the formula, follow the characters' personalities, and usually you can get to within 90% of the comic just by formula. And then that last 10%, I like to think that's the X factor that makes it hard for somebody to compete with me. In other words, I don't know exactly what it is that makes one person's comic works and another one not, but it's that last 10%. There's something that happens there.
That was one of the things that led you to your success, the rise of the internet, and you were one of the early adopters of that, because I think it was back in 1996 or so, you created your first website and used that to get fan mail, and most people weren't really using that medium to show their work or to communicate with an audience. So by doing that, you were able to get consistent suggestions for how to create new comics for your work, basically.
Actually, you've conflated two things. They're both in the same theme. In 1993, I was the first syndicated cartoonist to run an email address between the panels of the strip. And that was originally what got people sending me their ideas. So for years, I would just take the emailed suggestion and say, well, I've had that experience too. So I'll write about that. In 96, as you mentioned, was when Dilbert.com, the website, was started. And it's funny to look back at how innocent and simple those days were. At the time, it was considered risky to put my email in the strip because we worried that newspapers would think it's an advertisement. And since we charged them for the strip, we didn't want to run an advertisement that they were paying for, in that way anyway. So that was deemed risky. But I was allowed to do it because Dilbert was failing in the marketplace. So an experienced, let's say a comic strip that was already successful would not have taken that chance. And if you look back now, it just seems quaint and funny that we ever thought there was any risk to putting your email on your product.
Was there any thought for that risk? Or did you tell yourself, I'm going to just risk it? Or was there any logic behind that decision?
So it was basic risk management. If you were already successful, you would not want to introduce risk. But since I was failing, I was only in a few newspapers, maybe a few dozen at the time, and it wasn't growing. I had nothing to lose, so I could take a little bit more of a risk. So that's what made it work for me. But then when I did the website, it was the first syndicated cartoon that was available for free on the internet. Now, that sounds funny when you think about it through today's filter. It's like, well, what? Because basically every comic is free on the internet, whether it's also in newspapers or not. And at the time we thought, oh no, the newspapers are going to cancel me because I'm competing with them on this thing called the internet. Why would they pay for it if we're also giving it away for free? But again, that was a chance I could take that others couldn't, and it turned out to really work. In fact, what happened was, I became popular on the internet faster than I became popular in newspapers. And then the salespeople for the syndication company could go to each newspaper and say, look, it's already popular. You don't have to wonder if people like it. Look, the internet's going crazy for it. And then it became an easy sale and it sold into all the newspapers.
Wow. One of the things that stands out about that is you were failing with the comic. So you went from taking a rational approach, walking down the paved path, and did something that was, in a sense, a bit irrational for the general person. And it paid off in that sense.
Well, I would quibble with the use of irrational because, in terms of risk management, the most rational thing you could do is take a bigger risk when you have nothing to lose. So that actually was right by the numbers. The math in that case worked really well.
Huh. One of the things that is not as well known about you is that you had some other ventures you pursued outside of Dilbert. Can you talk about any one of those that stood out most to you?
Well, I'm a little bit famous for years ago. I tried to create a food product that had all of the nutritional requirements, the vitamins and minerals you need for the day. So that if you were like me, in those days especially, I was working crazy hours, 7 days a week. And it was hard to find time to eat, and it was even harder to find time to eat properly. So I thought, hey, if I can make this frozen burrito product, we can fortify it, and at least you'll have one thing that's easy, convenient, gives you everything you need. You're all set for the day. Long story short, we were successful in creating it and getting it placed in all the major supermarkets. We got tested in 7-Eleven, Costco, just Safeway, everything. But it didn't sell. Now, the first thing I learned was that most of those outlets are criminal enterprises, and I didn't know that. And what I mean by that is that for the smaller food producers, they're actually scamming them by charging them to be on the shelf. Now, if you're Kraft Foods, then you're not paying to be on the shelf because the supermarket needs you. Mm-hmm. But if you need the supermarket, they say, how about the first $50,000 you sell, we just keep. And then if that goes well, maybe we'll reduce how much you pay, but then you can be on the shelf and stay there, and that's good. So what you soon learn is that the whole game there is they're churning the bottom shelf. So they'll say, how about we'll pay this exorbitant amount, we'll put you on the bottom shelf, nobody's going to see you, and when we're done with that, we're going to say nobody bought your product because it was on the bottom shelf, and then we're going to bring in another new entrant who will give us another $50,000, and we'll make them fail next. So there was that. There was also, speaking of, I won't name names, but a large company sent their sales force in to bury our products on the shelf. And what that means is they literally send a human being into every 7-Eleven where their product is on the shelf, and they push their product in front of your product. So it actually just disappears. It's not visible to the public. So that happened to us in 7-Eleven. And the problem was we were competing against far less healthy products. Well, I'll just say the product. Screw it. They were Lunchables. So,
oh my goodness.
so the Lunchables were sort of the not the healthiest food in the world, and they were threatened by us because we were competing against that. And everywhere we checked in 7-Eleven, Lunchables had been pushed in front of our product. And as I found out later, that's actually a common dirty trick in the industry. So, and then there are a big grocery store, which will remain nameless because I don't feel like getting sued today. We would sell past the guarantee. In other words, we'd sell past the $50,000 or whatever we were going to give them up front, so that each sale after that we would make money. But instead of that, we'd get an invoice that says, well, we deducted the XYZ fee, so you get nothing. And we'd say, what XYZ fee? That was not in the contract. And the big supermarket would say, well, maybe not explicitly, but if you like, your other option is to not be on the shelf. So we'd say, damn it. It's only one more month, one more fee. As soon as we pay this off, we're making money. Next month, new invoice, new fee, same thing. So the play was to drive us off the shelf and to milk us as much as possible until we were gone. So anyway, the whole food industry is corrupt and crooked beyond imagination. and that product didn't work. And ultimately, the thing that made me stop trying is that I lost faith in the science, because we were using the best science about what vitamins and minerals you needed. And every other day I'd open up the internet or a magazine and I'd see a story that would say, well, it turns out this vitamin hurts you more than it helps you. And I'd be like, what? I thought nutrition was settled. I didn't know nutrition was an evolving science.
Right.
But it turns out most of what we thought we knew on nutrition and vitamins and minerals was all fake. It was all fake news. So even the nutrition pyramid was upside down, we've learned. So
that's crazy.
So the whole science in that field was all corrupt and ridiculous. So it wasn't possible to make a product that was right nutritionally because nobody knew what that was. So it wasn't, I didn't have a choice of succeeding because there was no path to that success.
Would you say that industry was something that was truly interesting to you in terms of pursuing it? And were there any other of your products that you felt were some things that you were really interested in pursuing outside of Dilbert?
I would say I was almost totally uninterested in food as a product. But it happened at a time in my career when I'd just made a tremendous amount of money and I was looking for some way to add something back to society. And I thought, well, here's a way I can do it. I can make a dent in, if not the physical offerings for healthy food, I can at least make a dent in the psychology of it.
Right.
So if people are even talking about the fact that there's a food that would give you everything you need, well, maybe somebody else will make that food someday if I don't. So that was more about a public purpose than a financial purpose.
Would you say there's been a specific approach of yours for navigating through failures and maintaining constant growth?
Yes. So my book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, is mostly on that topic. The big points are that I like to have a lot of things brewing. So at any time in my life, I was always working on the side or tinkering around or trying to get something else off the ground. And I try to pick projects that won't kill me if they don't work. So I don't put all of my money in anything. I don't, take a chance of going to jail or any of that stuff. So in terms of a portfolio, I like to have high-risk things, but only risk in terms of they'll probably not succeed. But if they did, they would succeed hugely. And if they didn't, it wouldn't cost me anything but embarrassment and some time. So I'm very resistant to embarrassment because I've failed enough in public that I realized it didn't hurt me. You can have a tremendous business failure, and as long as you did not risk all of your money, the next day you wake up and your coffee tastes the same. Your life is kind of the same.
Right.
You sort of lose the ability to be embarrassed after a while because there's nothing to it. It's just vapor. It's just a feeling that's you alone. Nobody else cares. I mean, they really don't. Other people don't care about you as much as you think. And you can actually learn to just be immune to it.
So it's, in a way, you're kind of building two things here. One, you're managing risk and taking calculated risks when you're starting new ventures. And then the second is you are basically building a thick skin or resistance to the thoughts and opinions of those around you because you've been exposed to failure so much that you know how it works and you know that you can still navigate and continue forward because everything is still the same essentially.
Yeah, it's sort of the startup model. I saw somewhere, I think it's true, that if you're starting your first startup and it fails, well, that's to be expected. Something like 1 in 10 first tries will fail. But if you go on to start a second startup, you end up being ahead of the curve, and it ends up reducing to something like 1 in 5. Now, I'm making up the numbers, but directionally, that's about right. So we do know that there are certain paths that reduce your risk and increase your odds of success, and they're pretty well known. So if you learn what those paths are, you're in much better shape. So in my case, I've calculated actually, I think I've failed at something like 30 different things, but I've succeeded hugely at about 3.
Wow.
And those 3, of course, more than pay for all the failures, many times over. So that's sort of a startup model where if you have the ability to start up more than one thing, eventually you're likely to get better at it. You're likely to get lucky at least once. And that's when the numbers are on your side. But don't bet everything. Don't
don't bet more than you can lose.
Yeah. So you gotta go into it with the assumption that it's a 10 try situation. And you gotta make sure you have enough resources for 10 tries.
One of the things that really stood out about you is that you had some really interesting thoughts on career choices and the pursuits people have. And on pursuing a career, you once mentioned that not every successful person has to have the passion for the career or industry they're in. And I think this is a direct quote. Correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned this in How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. It was, you'll discover that goals are for losers, passion is bullshit, and metacore skills can make you valuable. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, passion is one of those things that people who write business management books like to say because it sounds great and it sounds like something that everybody can do. So if you say, well, all you need for success is to find your passion, find your calling. And people hear that and they go, I could do that. I just have to find that thing that excites me. That's the key. And you'll even see billionaires say that. Billionaires like Zuckerberg, I think Richard Branson said it. A lot of billionaires will say, oh yeah, it's about the passion. If you find the passion, everything else comes together. But I ask you this, if you're a billionaire and you're answering this question in public, what else could you have said? Were you allowed to say, well, I succeeded because I'm smarter than other people? No, you can't say that. Even if you're positive it's true, you can't say that. Can you say, I succeeded purely by luck? Well, you'd be dumb to say that because let's say you're Richard Branson and you're starting one company after another and you're asking other people to invest and get on board. Do you think he wants people to think it's luck? Because I'm not going to invest if it was just luck the last time. So the story that everybody can sell that sounds good when you say it is it's passion. You can get it too. It's very democratic. I got passion. All you need is a little passion. But in the real world, the odds that your passion lines up with where you can make money are not that good, Mm-hmm. And I recommend that people find a way to make money. And if you find a way that makes you wildly rich, no matter what that is, you're going to find yourself getting excited about it, right? Things that make you rich are automatically a little more interesting than things that don't. And I also tell people to look around their room. Just look around your room. Almost every product in your room represents somebody who got rich. It might have been the founder of the company that made it. It might have been the CEO who's very highly paid. But everything in your room is boring. A chair, a table, a rug. But somebody got rich off of that rug, chances are. So passion is overrated. I say follow the money. If things work out financially, you're going to get real excited. And if you make money, well, then you've got more options. Maybe you can spend time doing stuff you like more than whatever your job was.
You're not the only one with that same mindset. I know Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs had a very similar thought process in that follow your passion is bad advice and that people should follow the opportunity and take their passions with them. And then even Mark Cuban goes so far as to say, pursue what you dedicate your time to. So it's a huge deviation from trying to find something that provides you immediate satisfaction and do things that either you're good at or that you find yourself doing a lot more often than not because that's a skill you can continue to develop and that you could probably make money on. I think one of the things I struggle with that is that if you're focusing on something that makes you a lot of money, how do you know for a fact that you're going to find happiness from that?
Well, I would say you don't need to know that, because if you find something that makes you a lot of money, it's going to open up options for taking your money to some other field. If you're smart, you're picking up new skills as you're making that money. You're finding new contacts. So you should see everything you're doing as the step to the next thing. And especially when you're young, and you'll see a lot of people make this recommendation. When you're young, you probably ought to just suck it up. Just follow the money, and especially follow the money. And this is critical, actually, not optional. Don't follow the money if it doesn't also prepare you for something better. If you're not learning something, etc. So when I had my corporate jobs, I worked at a bank and then at the phone company. Both those firms would allow you to take all kinds of training classes, everything from negotiating to communication, listening skills, just all kinds of stuff that would be helpful no matter what you did. So go for the money plus the learning, and that would include networking and meeting people who could help you later, etc. So I say take the hard course when you're young, because that'll make it easier later.
So basically, buy your way to freedom so you can pursue the things that you truly want to pursue, while also having the added benefit of having an expanded skill set from what you learned in your past.
Yeah, and I also note that people who have control over their own schedule are way happier than those who don't. And the example I give is if I said, do you want to eat? And you were not hungry. Well, even though you love to eat, if you're already stuffed and you're not hungry, eating is no fun. So it's not as if there are things which are fun and things that are not. That's not the whole story. You have to have the thing you want when you want it. In other words, you have to have control over when you do things in order to actually enjoy those things. You don't want to only exercise when you're already tired. You don't want to only eat when you're already full. So the sooner you can get from being a wage slave to somebody who has some control over what hour they spend doing what, that's where you want to end up, because that's where you can find some happiness.
Mm-hmm. And I think I've noticed that a lot in my work environment and my peers around me, is that they find a lot more satisfaction by being able to control the hours which they work and how they work. So as opposed to coming into an office at 6 a.m, they're actually being able to work from home and do their own work schedule. And it's much more freeing, so to speak, and it allows you greater opportunities to actually do things on your own time and do the things that you actually want to do.
Yeah, happiness is doing what you want when you want to do it. That's the simplest definition of happiness.
So I wanted to kind of turn the direction towards something that I found to be incredibly interesting about you. And this is a dual topic, mind you. You are a trained hypnotist, and you believe that Donald Trump hypnotized you.
Well, no, I've never said that sentence, but what I do believe, because I am a trained hypnotist, and I've been studying persuasion in all of its different forms as part of being a writer and communicator, that I noticed when Trump first burst onto the political scene as a candidate, that he had those same skills. And I also knew from experience that if you did not study persuasion, if you were not a hypnotist, if you hadn't spent a lot of time looking into this field, you wouldn't recognize the technique. So he would look like a crazy, orange clown. But if you knew what he was doing and you knew the technique, you would say what I said, which is in 2015, I said, "Oh world, you do not know what's coming," because somebody just brought a flamethrower to a stick fight and you think it's a fair fight. It's not. One of the players has his flamethrower. And by about the time that Trump labeled Jeb Bush as low-energy Jeb, that day, the same day that I saw that, I said publicly, I think in my blog, I said publicly that was the end of Jeb Bush. Now, exactly 0 people agreed with me, because he was the presumptive winner of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of Jeb Bush, because I could see the technique in the nickname that wasn't obvious. Most people said, "Oh, that's a funny, unusual insult." But what I saw was he had completely reframed Jeb from what I used to think, which is, wow, Jeb Bush, very experienced, calm, collected, executive kind of personality. Man, that is exactly the guy you want in charge if you've got trouble, because he's so calm and collected, calm energy. But the moment that Trump said he was low energy, that's all I could see, because he had contrasted Jeb's energy to his own, which was, 1,000,000 watts of orange energy. And it made Jeb just disappear, and he just faded out of sight. He took out the whole Bush dynasty before he took out the Clinton dynasty, and I saw that all coming just based on his tool set. Forget about politics, forget about whether you agree or disagree with his policies. Just the technique alone, we've never seen, and we might never see again. It's very unique.
I would say a lot of that kind of derives from his expertise as a business person and his skills in negotiation. I mean, like you mentioned, his way to frame his opponents, such as Shifty Schiff or crying Chuck Schumer, or even going back to the election, was calling Hillary Crooked Hillary. He has a way with words where he's able to kind of redirect attention towards odd aspects of other individuals, and it's very 3D chess-like when it comes to politics. But the one thing I'm always confused on is his negotiation style, because to me it always seems as though he's playing either the madman strategy or the Godfather role in his negotiations.
Well, maybe a little of both, depending on the situation. He does say, and he said this, publicly a number of times, that he is intentionally unpredictable, and I think we see that working to his favor in North Korea and Iran. Because if you're the leaders of North Korea or Iran, can you be totally sure he's not going to launch a nuclear strike? You think so? I mean,
right.
you're pretty sure, but unlike other people who are consistent and predictable, you can't really tell. And so that gives him a definite upper hand in negotiating. And he also likes to just shake the box like crazy. Just take some variable and just rip it apart and see what you got left, which is really good for those situations that have been ossified. Everybody's just stuck in their position, and he'll just come in and just overturn the table, and suddenly everybody's scrambling to pick things up, and when they do, all the variables are different. And then he's got something to work with.
Yeah, I remember having James Johnson, who's a professional negotiator, on one of my last episodes, and he wrote a book called Skill Negotiation. And in the show, we were talking about how Trump's negotiation strategy is kind of out of tune and a bit aggressive, so to speak, because like you said, you don't know. He's unpredictable with what he says, and I guess to his benefit, it's sort of an advantage, because the other negotiator, other opponent, doesn't know how he's going to react, so they kind of have to play it safe when it comes to a risk standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. He introduces extra risk for the person on the other side of the table. And he also is good at inventing an asset that he can take away. So when he met with Kim Jong-un, he had given him respectability. And that's the way the world saw it. It's like, hey, why are you giving him respectability when you've got nothing in return?
Right.
To which I said, no, he just created an asset he can take away. So, and he does this consistently. He creates an asset that can be taken away. It didn't exist anywhere. So he'll often accuse somebody of some heinous thing that they've got to make good, and you'll say, oh, I get it. He's just creating an issue where none was there before, so he'll have something to trade away.
Huh. I've never thought about that before, and it's almost as if he's always 2 steps ahead of his opponent. It's interesting. One thing I gotta ask, just rewinding, moving off the topic of politics and more directly on hypnotism itself, How has it impacted your life directly, and what are some of the key takeaways that you took from it?
Well, I would say that the way hypnosis affected my life has very little to do with actually hypnotizing people in some kind of a formal way. What it really does is changes how you see the world. Because in order to be a hypnotist, you have to accept that people are fundamentally irrational. And the normal way that people see the world is we'd say, well, yeah, sure, people can get a little, wound up when they're emotional. They can get irrational. But basically, people are rational, I don't know, maybe 90% of the time. That would be the common view of the world. The hypnotist view, and the one that changes everything about how you see the world and how you operate in it, is that we're irrational 90% of the time. On anything that has any emotional content, we're irrational. And only things that we don't care about, we're even capable of being rational. Balancing your checkbook, just looking up the hours of a store, just simple stuff. So once you see the world that way, and you see that filter on everything makes more sense. Because have you ever been in a situation where you tried to use logic and reason to change somebody's mind? And you kept using your logic and your reason and your facts, and they're not even questionable facts. They're facts that are well established. You can see them in every source. There's just no way around it. You made an argument that is airtight, and it doesn't change anybody's mind. So if you think we're a rational species, you're going to be frustrated and angry all day long, because you won't understand why what you're doing isn't working. But once you realize that we're irrational all the time, you can, first of all, accept the irrationality as, okay, I expected that, so it doesn't bother you as much. But secondly, you can deal with it productively, because you can say, okay, I don't know what the real problem is here, but it's not the facts, and it's not the argument. So then you can maybe go deeper and say, all right, are you really afraid of something? Is there something that you're afraid of? And sometimes that digging a little deeper will get you to where you can persuade.
When you talk about that, it reminds me of a type of theory called cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR, where it's in a sense you're hypnotized, but the purpose of it is to reframe your mindset or perspective on the anxieties you're facing. And I actually have this up on my internet right now, and it's your blog, episode 791, Scott Adams excerpt, I will rewire your brains to relieve anxiety. And I haven't started it yet, but that sounds very similar to what we're talking about right now, right?
Well, first of all, the content you're referring to there was experimental, meaning I'm not asserting that it works. I was doing an experiment with my listeners, and they would tell me if it worked. Many of them did, by the way. And the idea was that if you have a fear of something, some kind of phobia, fear, and that could be anything from OCD to fear of crowds, whatever it is, that it might be because you have an overzealous protection of your ego. Or in other words, your ego is a little too active. And what I talked about is exercising to reduce your ego so that you don't feel like you're so important you must be protected from every risk. Now, you'll still protect yourself from ordinary risk. You'll look both ways before you cross the road. But thinking of yourself, and this is the short version, so it's not going to be very persuasive, but the short version is if you can imagine yourself in the moment, and I give people an exercise where you just look around the room and just pretend, and it's just imagination, just pretend that you're in a 3D rendered environment. And then look at all the objects like you're looking at a 3D rendered, almost like a video game, and you're inside it. Now, I'm not saying that those things are 3D rendered. I'm not saying you are living in a simulation. What I'm saying is that this exercise puts you in the moment. It just takes you out of your, what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow head, where all the worrying is. And it puts you in the moment about something that doesn't worry you. And I think that also decreases your ego, because it it just takes you out of that worrying about your safety, your health, your reputation, your shame, your embarrassment, all that stuff. And I also speculated that the reason that psychedelics are, at least allegedly, can cure people of various mental health problems in one dose, just one dose. There are plenty of reports of that, is because when you're doing hallucinogens, and I have a little experience with that, it takes your ego out of your perceptions for a while. So you become one with the world as if the world is brand new and you're just part of it, but you're no longer the special observer. You're just part of it.
Right, and there's been a lot of studies on that. I know they've done it with psilocybin, which are basically mushrooms, as well as ketamine, and reducing the effects of PTSD or depression in certain individuals. And there's been a lot of trials on it, and a lot of them have been proven to be very successful so far. So I'm really curious to see what further trials showing that. But from what you've mentioned, there's been a lot of similar thoughts on the effects of those drugs, specifically on the impact of like the human psyche and emotions from those.
Yeah, I think in the next 5 years, I think that psychedelics will be a standard, literally a cure for lifelong mental problems of certain types, not every type. If you're schizophrenic, stay away from the acid.
So, you recently released a book titled Loser Think: How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America, which dives into, again, the mindset of individuals in society and how they don't necessarily think before, or don't read or think before they say. Can we dive into that book a bit?
So, loser think is about unproductive thinking strategies. It's not about the person being a loser. And the idea is that we all have different experiences. So, we've been exposed to different domains of thought. So, a scientist, for example, would learn the scientific method, would learn how to compare things, to have a control study, etc. A whole set of thinking that sits on top of the actual technical expertise. Likewise, an economist learns how to compare things productively, how to calculate the time value of money, how to think about the sunk costs and stuff like that. That again sits on top of the details of being an economist. So if you've been exposed to the domains in which people literally learn how to think, they learn the technical details, but on top of that, they learn how to think productively. And a lot of people have not been exposed to that. And I noticed this by interacting on Twitter, when people would make comments that even if I disagreed with the comment, I would say to myself, well, that's actually a well-reasoned point. Mm-hmm. I might disagree. And I'll click on the profile, and more often than not, it's an engineer or an economist or a scientist, sometimes a lawyer. And then I would get other comments from people criticizing me for one thing or another that would just look absolutely crazy. Like, what is wrong with you? How could a human being have these thoughts? And I would click on the profile, and just a huge correlation. It would be artist, musician, journalist. Those are the three you'd see the most. And I realized that there are people who follow, let's say, one channel that to their career have simply not been exposed to how to think productively. And here's the bad part. They don't know it. Because there are a lot of skills that you don't have. For example, can I shoot a three-pointer as good as Stephen Curry? No, I know that. I know I can't do that. But go to the average person who's not good at thinking and ask them if they're good at thinking. And they'll say, yeah, I am. Of course. I'm great at thinking. Yeah, I haven't studied economics, but how much do I need? So it's a case of you don't know what you don't know. And what Loser Think does is it gives you just the high-level thinking techniques across domains, so it fills in the gaps.
Why do you think Loser Think is so pervasive in our society? Do you think that it's rooted in one specific action?
Well, let me give you an example, and it really clarifies it. We all know about the climate activist Greta Thunberg, and she's been super effective in getting her message out, selling the story, etc. Recently, Secretary Mnuchin was asked about her, and he made an offhand comment about, maybe after she studies economics, she would be qualified to give an opinion about how to, which direction to steer the entire economy of the United States. And I said to myself, that's it. That's the whole story. That's everything you need to know. I love Greta's enthusiasm, her intentions, her salesmanship, her spunk, her bravery. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's very positive about that young woman, but she hasn't studied economics. And if you're going to make a decision about the entire economy of the world, you'd better study some economics, because she's missing a lot of basics and doesn't know it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with Greta. She has no evil intentions. She's not unintelligent. She simply has not been exposed to how an economist would look at it. And an economist would look. Let me give you a perfect example. The UN most official estimates about climate change is that it could knock something like 10% off the GDP 80 years from now. But if you're an economist, you hear that news and you say to yourself, so what? By then, our economy will be something like 5 to 10 times bigger than it is. So if it's 10% less than it could have been in 80 years, but it's still 5 times as big, you literally wouldn't even notice. Nobody would know the difference. So Greta, because she's not an economist, says, hey, 10% of your GDP, that sounds like a major worldwide depression. That sounds like a big problem. Talk to Mnuchin or somebody with his background, and he'll say, are you kidding? 10% says we won't even notice. Now, those are different worlds. And does Greta know that she has that gap in her mental models? And I would say probably not. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with Greta. It means that none of us know. None of us know what we don't know. We only know what we know.
I would say a lot of that is a byproduct to how people want to receive information nowadays. You would have people back in the day actually reading books, and then when the television came around, people's attention spans reduced, and then once you have the internet, further reduced, and then you have phones, and you have apps such as Twitter, and people don't have the attention spans to read. So next thing you know, people are just reading headlines, and not to use this term strictly, but you hear the term fake news. People are just reading headlines, and either they believe what they read from that, or they don't believe what they read. And I don't think people are taking the time to really understand the underlying facts, or to do their own research on the topic. And then from there, you'll have this kind of drone mentality where one person follows the next, and then the person behind them follows them, because they've all read the headline of the article or that tweet, but none of them actually think for themselves.
One of the things I predicted in 2015 is that Trump would change more than politics, that he would change how we viewed reality itself. And this might be one of those situations. So you're talking about our attention span decreased, and I think that's true. The media that we consume decreased our attention span. But I think what's less true is that that's the problem. I think instead that what that's doing is ripping a hole in the fabric of the universe, because we're watching each other and we're saying, wait a minute, you're not even looking at the details and you've reached a conclusion. So now we can notice it in the other people. Okay, you didn't read a book on that topic. You read an MSNBC headline on that topic. So it's a little more obvious that we're not rational, which is actually a gigantic improvement over how we all saw the world even a few years ago. We now see the unambiguous, complete irrationality of the other people, which means we're halfway there. All right. The other half is to realize we're just like them. All right. Most of us are not there. But once you get to that point, you're really free. And that's when you can make a difference. Here's what I say in Loserthink. In Loserthink, I point out that it's a total con job to tell the American public, you're smart. If you do your own research on these topics, you can come to a wise decision. There's no evidence that people can do that. Not now, not Americans, not anybody, not smart people, not dumb people. How do I know that? Because on every topic that's complicated, from climate change to international trade deals to anything that's complicated, you have the smartest, most informed people in the world on different sides. Mm-hmm. And when you observe that, it's obvious that humans are not people who can research things and come to a conclusion. It's just not a thing we can do. Now, we can research easy stuff, like super easy stuff. But if you say to me, Scott, check out all this climate change stuff, give me an opinion. And I spent over a year climbing down the wells of what the skeptics said, what the scientists on the consensus side said, and trying to compare them. And here's what I found. If the last thing you read was from a skeptic, you think it's right. If the last thing you read was from the scientist who addressed what the skeptic said, you would think the consensus of the scientist is right. And it's very much like watching a legal case where you watch the prosecutor say, well, here's all the reason this guy's guilty. And you say to yourself, that's a really good argument. I mean, the facts, it all lines up. And then the defense comes in. And 10 minutes later, you say to yourself, innocent, totally innocent. And nothing changed except whose argument you heard last. So we are a species who believes the last thing we hear. And anybody who thinks that they have researched climate change and achieved some kind of a meaningful personal opinion is totally delusional. It's the least likely thing that any human can do. In fact, I don't even know how many people who are experts in climate change and climate science, how many of them would have enough direct experience with all the different elements that go into that? Were they actually in the field taking measurements from thermometers? Have they put buoys in the ocean to measure them? Have they worked on satellites? Are they experts in the chemistry of the air? So even the experts probably are only pretty good with the thing that they're the expert on the most. So we're largely flying blind, and we're a bunch of clueless people, crawling through the dark, and every once in a while something good happens.
Wow. So what are some ways what are some things that an individual can do on a daily basis to reduce the effect of loserthink?
Well, there are a lot of things. So when it comes to a complex topic, I always say that the least credible person is the person who is sure. So it doesn't matter what side you're on, but if you say, I am positive that the latest trade agreement with China is a good deal, well, you're probably an idiot. If you're positive it's a bad deal, you're also an idiot. Because the one thing you can't be sure of is whether it's a good or bad deal. You could feel strongly that it makes sense. That would be okay. You could feel strongly that there's a risk. That would make sense. But if you're sure, that's a problem, that needs to be fixed. The other thing I tell people is to make sure they're sampling the news from different sides. If you're looking at just the news that leans left, you have no idea what the other argument is, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. It turns out that conservatives are far more likely to have sampled the news on the left than the right. And I see that all the time when I see conservatives talking about an issue. They are clearly aware of the argument on the left, and then they're aware of their own argument on the right. If you talk to people who are on the left, they typically have such a bad feeling about, let's say, consuming Fox News that they just won't do it. So they're actually not even aware of the argument. And that is a huge problem. So I tell people to sample the news and don't believe anything that isn't reported the same on both. So if both Fox News and CNN, as two proxies for the left and the right, if they both say a hurricane's coming, well, back up your stuff because there's a hurricane coming. But if one of them says, somebody is a Russian spy, and the other one says, I don't see it, probably not. Probably not, right? So look for them both to agree to figure out what's reliable.
So before we get to the closing portion of the show, I wanted to bring up your thoughts on setting new rules for when society changes. And I came across, I believe it was an article in which you mentioned that since social media has become so prominent, that there should be a few new rules added. And just to quickly summarize those, the first was 48-hour rule, and the second was a 20-hour rule. Can you touch on those?
Yeah, the 48-hour rule says that as a sort of a process and a system that's good for civilization, is that if somebody does something that offends you, let's say they tweet about it or they post it on social media, you should give them 48 hours to either correct it, if there's a factual problem, or to clarify and say, no, I didn't mean that, didn't mean to offend you, and apologize. And my rule is that if people do that, and it's a proper apology, that we should accept it, even if we think it's insincere. Because we're not mind readers, but we are a society that does like to check people back in place. So if you think somebody tweeted that Nazis are awesome, and then you say, hey, you tweeted something that suggests that Nazis are great people. Did you mean that? And then the person is likely to say, no, I wrote it wrong. It should have meant something else. That you should not then suspect that they didn't mean it. We're just better off if we say, okay, you did that in 2 days. That was plenty of time. You corrected it. I accept it. So whether you believe it or not, it's just better to accept the apology and move on. And then likewise, the other rule is a 20-year rule, that if you did something more than 20 years ago that other people are offended by or find horrible, that we should ignore everybody's bad behavior if it's more than 20 years ago. Now you could make some exceptions if it's pedophilia or murder or something. But I'm talking about offensive stuff. Mm-hmm. Because we're not really the same people we were 20 years ago. And if we live a proper life, and I define that as being born completely selfish, but learning how to give back more and more as you age, and then your final moment on earth is you give away all your possessions, then you die, or at the moment of death you give away all your possessions. That if you're following that path, you're becoming a better person. So the me at age 62 should be, if I've done everything right, should be a much better person than me at age 20. Mm-hmm. So if you blame me for what I did at age 20, it's a terrible world to live in. I don't want to live in that world. And it's also completely inaccurate because I'm just not that person anymore. So the quick version of that is I don't like to blame people for who they used to be. And that's just a good rule for the future. And it wasn't that important until social media, because if you did something dumb in high school, well, nobody would know. You're 40 years old, nobody knows what you did in high school, but now we do. Now there's a permanent record of every dumbass thing you've ever done. So,
yeah, I happen to like that rule a lot because with social media being so prominent, everybody has access to information that goes back over a decade. And if you are about to achieve something great, someone's going to bring up that skeleton in your closet out of nowhere and hold it against you or that specific individual. So by having that rule in place, you're kind of able to negate the effects of something that wasn't necessarily who you are today. It was an older version of you, and since then you've kind of progressed a lot. You've grown as a human being, and you've changed not only in your opinions and thoughts, but your character as well.
Yeah, and if you want to get scientific, just about every cell in your body has been replaced, over 20 years. Wow. So you're actually not even physically the same thing anymore. You're different matter, literally.
Wow, that's incredible. So when I do the closing portion of my show, I like to end things by asking 5 questions to my guest. So I'm just going to shoot these out to you, and you can feel free to answer them how you would like or to your best of ability.
All right.
So the first question is, what is your favorite comic outside of Dilbert, and why?
Pearls Before Swine by Stefan Postis, because it's always clever and fun and it's edgy. So of the comics that are currently in the world today, not counting retired people, he would be my top.
If someone wanted to pursue a career in writing or comics, what advice would you give them?
Number one, Google the day you became a better writer and my name. So Google that phrase, the day you became a better writer. It's a very short, one-page description of how to be a better writer that's been viral for, 10 years. It keeps popping up because writers like it so much. It summarizes the technique. So do that. Also, check out a book by Stephen King called On Writing, On Writing. And he talks about some strategies of starting small and how to build yourself up to get more attention. So those would be things. And then there's a book called Writers' Markets. You can find it on Amazon or on the internet, Writers' Markets. And it tells you, depending on what kind of writing you're doing, whether it's poetry or fiction, nonfiction, whatever, where to send it, where to submit it, how to do it. So those tools are about 80% of it. And what I've discovered, here's the best advice you'll ever get if you want to be a writer. There is more demand for writing than there is supply, which seems backwards to your experience. Because you say to yourself, hey, there must be 1 million people who want to be writers, and there can't be that many places that would pay them. So isn't there imbalance? And what you'll learn is that the people who want writers are desperate for good ideas, even if they're poorly written. So if you can submit something to some local publication, to a magazine, and they look at it and they say, I love the idea, but it's not even written very well, they will actually help you rewrite it. Mm-hmm. So having a good idea is more important than having perfect sentence structure, because editors will work with you to fix your sentences, but editors do not think up their own good ideas. They like that to come from the outside. So you definitely 100% can find some place to get your writing published if it's any good at all. And when I say any good, I really mean just the idea. It doesn't even have to be well written.
Looking back, what is some of your work that you would like to be known for outside of Dilbert?
I sometimes ask myself what I will be remembered for, which is a slightly different version of that. And I don't think it's going to be Dilbert. If I had to guess today, I would guess that my book had failed almost everything and still win big, because that's the book that introduced two concepts that are radically changing people's lives, and I hear about it every day. And also, when I say these two concepts, you're going to say, I think I've heard of these in other places. But if you track it back, you'll find most of those other places came from me. One of those is the idea of systems being better than goals, and the other is the idea of a talent stack, because both of those are very concrete strategies for an ordinary person to build an extraordinary life. And it doesn't require any magic or luck. It's just a pretty straightforward mathematical process that'll get you there faster.
Mm-hmm. If you could share a message with the listeners out there, what would you say?
The one thing that's the most important thing in the world for me to say, I would say this: your ego is not your friend or your protector. It is probably an enemy that you let inside the tent. And if you can learn to control your ego by putting yourself in situations that will continuously embarrass you, and then you don't die, and you eventually will learn to be able to take better risks. And when I say risks, I don't mean the kind that could kill you. I mean the kind where you ask out that boy or girl that you were too afraid to ask out. I mean the kind where you go and apply for another job, even if you're not entirely sure you're qualified for it. So once you can get your ego under control, your opportunity for a better life and success in every way probably doubles. I mean, I would say it at least doubles your odds of a good life.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question, which is a very slight twist on the prior one, is what would you most like to tell people that nobody ever asks about?
Is that limited to something about me?
Anything.
The thing I'd most well, that's a tough question for me because all I do is talk about what I want to talk about all day long. I mean, I'm literally entering my third hour of talking about things I want to talk about just today. So I don't know that there's anything in that category left. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll give you one. In the interest of answering fairly, I think people don't quite understand the degree to which their body forces their mind to think what it thinks. We think of the world the opposite way. We think that we have a thought, and then that thought gets executed into our body. Then our body does stuff. And that's true. I mean, that's literally true. That's what happens. But it's more productive to think that the places you put your body and the things you subject it to are causing your thoughts. So we've all had the experience, if you're tired or hungry, you might be angry. But if you're not, you're not. So most important thing is to understand that we do not have a fixed personality. We all think that we are some kind of core person, but we don't. We are ever-changing personalities, and it's our body chemistry, which is mostly affected by what positions we put ourselves in. Did we eat? Did we sleep? What kind of challenges are we taking on? So if you think of yourself as body influencing mind, you'll get much farther than if you think it only works the other direction. Mm-hmm. So I've never really been able to talk about that because it's hard to sell. I don't think people buy it the first time they hear it. It's something you have to have in the back of your mind and then observe. And then 5 years from now, you're going to say to yourself, damn it, that cartoonist guy was right. If I just manage my body first, I get my mind where I want it. I did not expect that to be true.
Wow. Well, I love that answer. Well, Scott Adams, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. And for those interested in interacting with you or learning more about you, they can find you on Twitter and Periscope at Scott Adams Says. And then also you have a website, which is also scottadamsays.com. You also have a few books out, including Loser Think, How Untrained Brains Are Ruining America, as well as How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. So again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an awesome conversation.
Thank you. Great questions, and I enjoyed every bit of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the All Things Interesting podcast with my guest, Scott Adams. From creating positive affirmations and exploring hypnotism to the creativity behind the storied comic Dilbert and how to fail at almost anything and still win big. I hope everyone learned a bit more, had a laugh, and ultimately enjoyed the episode. If anyone is interested in learning more or following Scott, I will be posting some links in the description of the show, which can be found on my website, teshercohen.com. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast hosting platform, and drop a comment. Thanks again, and stay tuned for more episodes of the All Things Interesting podcast.